Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world. With self-care strategies from Chinese medicine, functional medicine, Ayurveda, neuroscience, and beyond. I'm your host, Brody Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and transformation catalyst, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Brody Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and holistic health coach, and today's episode is for all you personal evolution junkies. You probably know your Myers-Briggs type or your Enneagram number. And my guest today is here to tell you why labeling yourself as an INFJ or an Enneagram 6 might actually be holding you back. Dr. Benjamin Hardy is an organizational psychologist, successful entrepreneur, and best-selling author of Willpower Doesn't Work, which I learned a lot about and a lot from in teaching my habit change science course, Level Up Your Life. His blog is read by millions of people monthly, and he's been featured in Forbes, Fortune, and CNBC. He's a regular contributor to Inc., Psychology Today, and a super popular author on Medium. His new book, Personality Isn't Permanent, provides science-based strategies for reframing past memories, becoming the scribe of your identity narrative, upgrading your subconscious, and redesigning your environment. Dr. Benjamin Hardy, welcome to A Healthy Curiosity.
Happy to be with you, Brody.
I am curious how your work evolved from talking about willpower to talking about personality.
Yeah. It's interesting. I wasn't necessarily, with Willpower Doesn't Work, the concept evolved while I wrote it. I mean, the ideas often go through a deep evolutionary process as you're actually doing them. There's kind of an initial germ of an idea or whatnot. And in my case, I sold the idea and then you develop it as you go. Willpower Doesn't Work was originally sold as the proximity effect. That's actually what the book was supposed to be called. And it was going to be called that up until the last minute. And I just didn't really like that title. It was very academic and strange, the idea of proximity being your environment.
Yes.
And about what surrounds you shapes you in many ways. And so I had written an article called Willpower Doesn't Work. Here's how to change your life. Like a while before I even had written that book. And then I just was really like, it needs to be about this clash between the inner and the outer. And so that book kind of was more about just behavior and about, as you said, habit formation and just really about moving your life forward. I wrote that book because personally I'd watched my younger brother, but so many other people who have all the talent and capability in the world not make any progress forward because they just continue to be surrounded by the wrong types of influences, which will always keep them stuck. And so that was kind of just a book written in frustration, not really in frustration, but almost in desperational plea that you can't do this on your own, and anyone who's trying to overcome an addiction eventually comes to the realization that they can't do it through grit and willpower. You have to get help and other things like that. So the shift over to personality, actually, so I have a friend named Joe Polish, and he's kind of been a mentor to some degree, but he's very interested in the subject of addiction. And obviously, he really loved Willpower Doesn't Work because there was a deep connection there. As far, and the book obviously isn't fully about addiction, but there's a huge application, obviously, with Willpower Doesn't Work to addiction as just one application of the book. And he took me to an event. I went up and listened to Dr. Gabor Mate. Have you heard of him?
Yeah.
So we went together, and him and Joe are good friends. Do you like his work by chance, maybe?
Oh, absolutely. Just that I feel like, for those who may not be so familiar, he does a lot with trauma, correct?
Yeah. And that was the pathway that Joe took me down and it was really out of interest for how trauma facilitates addiction, because Joe's big focus is addiction. And I had an interest in that because I grew up in an interesting background where my parents got divorced. My father became an extreme drug addict. And ultimately that's been a big thing that shaped my thinking. My younger brother even has been an addict. And actually literally last week I took him to a treatment facility. It was a really interesting experience. So I went up to a Gabor Mate event because Joe and Gabor are actually good friends, and we spent 3 days learning about trauma. and how it leads to things like addiction. But one of the things that Gabor spent a lot of time talking about, and this was in, I think, January of 2018. This was just before Personality Isn't Permanent came out, but it was after it had been being written. And one of the big things that Gabor kept talking about was personality. And I thought it was so interesting about how trauma shapes personality. And it just kept sticking out to me because, I mean, I'd spent a lot of time studying personality, and I just thought that was an interesting application. And then later that year, I read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is obviously a really deep book on trauma. And again, the subject of personality came out and was just talking about how trauma freezes and keeps your personality stuck in the past. It keeps you emotionally underdeveloped. You become psychologically rigid. Your hope and imagination for the future stop, and your whole focus becomes the past.
Or
and
survival in general, right? Like just staying
Yeah.
safe as opposed to growing.
Yeah. I mean, it really shrinks your comfort zone. And I kind of view personality as another word for comfort zone. And so
I like that.
I just thought, okay, it brought up many perspectives given my education in psychology about personality and many of the ways that people look at it. I'm like, okay, I need to write a book about, and obviously my whole book's not about trauma, although trauma is a big aspect of what keeps personality stuck. But I just felt like I needed to write a book on this subject to kind of explain to people some of the deeper aspects of why we can get stuck, and about the idea that you aren't just who you are, and that's not actually a good justification. And I felt like it could be a good way to point out flaws in things like personality tests. So I thought it was just a good opportunity to provide really useful ideas for how people can change. I've never actually explained that development or that progression. You kind of had to you kind of had me thinking there for a minute. So sorry if it was
underdeveloped. Oh, no.
Thinking.
I love having something that is fresh and off the cuff and that hasn't been said 10,000 times already in various ways. It seems like you're locating this idea of the self as much broader than we think of it as, like, right? That when we think about our environment's impact on what it is that we do, right? It's that going back to what you were first talking about with addiction, that we know that it's pretty hard to get clean if you're surrounded by a bunch of people using drugs, or it's pretty hard to eat right if the wrong kind of food is front and center in your environment. The idea that we get cues from our environment as to what it is, how we are to act, what it is that we are to do. And so that's kind of like that, to me, that idea of the environment, that we're constantly shaped by our environment in ways, in behavioral ways, and in cues. We literally also are interchanging our energy with the environment all the time. With the microbiome internally is affected by the aerobiome that surrounds us. And changes by what we put into our bodies. That in Chinese medicine, there's very much this notion that we are ecosystems, and like we are ourselves an ecosystem, but that we're also part of an environment, and that different factors in that environment highlight or bring out different aspects of ourselves, for better and for worse. And the idea also in Chinese medicine exists that when we undergo a trauma, we contract, and that certain ways of staying safe, certain ways of adapting to this trauma can be kind of frozen in our psyches. And with The Body Keeps the Score, this idea that physically in our the corporeal aspect of who we are, the cells of our body, it has the memories of the past, and this is basically an example of qi and blood stagnating, which is not what we need in order to be healthy and free, right? That we need to overcome, that energy needs to flow like a river, and when it gets stuck and becomes like a stagnant pond, that problems arise. And so we have this notion that we come into the world with a particular constitution that is our original nature, that bestows upon us particular strengths and weaknesses at a DNA level. Like some of us are more outgoing by nature. Some of us are naturally gifted at music, say, or writing. Some of us have iron stomachs, but weak backs, for example, that's part of our original nature. Are you saying that we don't have an original nature?
I'm not necessarily saying we don't have an original nature, but I'm certainly saying that original nature is not fixed. Going back to the idea of a living system,
Yep.
I'm honestly less interested in the original nature, and I'm more interested in the future self. Although I think it's good to have a tap on the original nature. I actually recently retook a personality test because I was requested to do so. In the book, I talk about, and I'm not like just going through some script. I'm literally going to answer your question, but like
Sure.
I took a personality test, and I talk about it in the book. It wasn't even intended to be in the book, but I came up with a certain score, and the score almost led my wife to not marrying me because her parents were worried about the personality profile that I had. And so it's kind of a comical first take on just the situation, but on a podcast or a situation I was recently on, I was requested to retake the test just to see what I would get. Because one of the big arguments I make in the book, aside from the fact that the tests are kind of pseudoscience, is that your personality does change over time, regardless of intention. So I retook the test, but one of the things that surprised me that I didn't remember about this test, and it was really, now that I'm looking at it, a poorly designed test, but it talked about answer the questions as you would as a child. So like I went through multiple scenarios, and it's like answer the best you can the way you would have responded to this situation as a child. And like as a psychologist, that kind of concerns me because I have that's not really, I don't know how I would have handled a lot of the scenarios as a child. I could do my best to think about it. I would probably handle them different at age 5 than I would at age like 8, 9, 10, 12, 14, like.
Right. Childhood is a big span of time.
Yeah, I didn't really clarify many parameters. And honestly, if that's the case, I probably should have just had my parents answer the test because I can't really fully remember too much about that. And I thought the question was really weird, to be honest with you, because I'm not the same person I was at age 5.
Right.
Maybe it's trying to tune me back to this core nature that you're trying to describe, but I don't think that that's actually, and that may not even be what you're looking for. And I'd be interested in kind of how you define that. I mean, I definitely believe in a more spiritual sense, but I don't believe that that's the self I was born as that I need to find again. I think that and so I believe in like a spiritual nature, but I don't believe like that I was born a certain person that I must become.
Yeah, and I think that has all sorts of room within it. And the Chinese medicine take would be that we have essentially that there is an original nature that we're born with certain innate gifts and traits, and it's our choice as to whether or not, like, basically that those that are our innate gifts, both physiological and psychological, set us up for the curriculum that we have for this life. And this is kind of a Taoist notion. It's not it's not mandatory to believe in this to get acupuncture, but it's one way of looking at things. And the idea that as trauma happens, in order to stay safe, in order to navigate our early life experiences, that really, like, whether or not we were victims of abuse or went through something horrific as children, we all still are shaped by our early caregivers, and we want to please them. And so the idea of putting energy at being shaped by the people around us early in life, that creates a kind of a social self or a survival strategy that in and of itself can be labeled, right? Like, this person became a people pleaser. They're kind of an earth type, or this person became an overachiever. They're kind of a wood type. And the idea that we have all of the different wood, fire, earth, metal, water constitutional traits within us. And I like to introduce people to show how we don't have to be bound by it, right? It can be really useful to know what our go-to survival strategies are so that we can put them down and realize that we actually have other tools in the toolbox, and that we don't have to kind of keep going down the same roads over and over again in order to navigate life, that there's lots of different ways to do it. And that helping people understand kind of like what are these learned survival strategies versus like which may or may not match up with who we believe ourselves to be if we have some sort of original nature, but also to think about, well, what do I want to be like in the future? Like, do I want to be bound by the past, or how can I grow in this different direction? And part of that is, like, one of the things I love about Chinese medicine is the fact that we have these ways of understanding different dimensions of life and different aspects of our minds and emotions and physicality. and as well as virtues, as well as like all kinds of things. And that when we look at ourselves and think like, oh yeah, that's me being overly yang and not enough yin, or like that's me being too metal and too judgmental and not flexible enough, or that we can see these traits in ourselves that come out at different points, what usually when we're under stress, when we contract and we're not just letting right action arise by itself in the moment. So it's one of those things where like having this framework can be useful, so, not so that we can label ourselves, but so that we can transcend it. And I'm thinking that might be what you're getting at too, right? That there's a way that we can understand, that it does us no good to be put into a box and stay there.
It definitely doesn't, for many, many different reasons. There's so much of what you're saying that I love and that is useful and that I think is like, I love everything you're saying about trauma and it contracting you, and also just kind of having, I guess you could call it labels or just frameworks for understanding, like calling it metal or what ways of understanding when you're in a rhythm, or when you're kind of going through a mode, even if that mode has become your kind of go-to, even though it's maybe not effective in this moment, or it's kind of keeping you from learning and developing other ways of being.
Yeah.
So I think that's really great and useful. Yeah, there's a lot of really great research that piqued my interest that I didn't really even know was there before I started writing this book. And a lot of it comes from Daniel Gilbert at Harvard. I think his work is really interesting. He gave a TED Talk called The Psychology of Your Future Self. Really, I would be interested in your take on it, given your perspectives. I'm still trying to figure out where I'm landing with how you see things, because it to me, it feels like it feels very mixed between East and West. And so I'm feeling some East and I'm feeling some West when you're describing how, it's not leaning too far one way or the other as I'm hearing you talk. But that may be by design. It may be just because you're a Westerner, but have really adopted Eastern perspectives. So I'm still just listening strongly and trying to understand. But from my perspective, and kind of with the research that I think is interesting to share, but it's not just research from my perspective. I mean, the reason it's interesting to me is because of my perspectives and my experiences. What Dr. Gilbert has found, and I think it's interesting, is he will ask people, and I've actually asked hundreds of people the same question: are you the same person you were 10 years ago? Most people's actual gut reaction is no. Given your perspective on like core self, maybe you'd have a different answer, but most people say like, no, I am not the same person. Actually, a lot of people are quick to say not even close. I'm not even near the same person I was 10 years ago. What Gilbert then asks, when he doesn't even really, he's actually broken up. Usually he'll ask a different population. Actually, I've further gone and figured out, but like, he'll ask other people, like, do you think you'll be the same person in 10 years as you are today? And that's where it gets a little tricky, because what he's found is that although people can readily see that they're not quite the same human being they were 10 years ago, or at least they see the world very differently, they've got different habits, they've got different perspectives, often we very much downplay potential change in the future. And his hypothesis is that we really overemphasize and overvalue our current preferences and our current perspectives. So like, we think that who we are is who we are, and we downplay potential change in the future, although we're likely going to be just as different in the future as we are from our former selves. And then further researchers have gone on and kind of studied this whole concept of future self as a concept. And, I would be really interested in your take on how this relates to being present and being mindful. But the idea is that without viewing your future self as a different person with different perspectives, different priorities, and kind of clarifying who that person is to some degree, it's actually very difficult, if not impossible, to live intentionally in the moment. Like, if you don't know where you want to go as a person, it becomes very difficult to make decisions here and now that are directed at something. You can kind of be, I guess, in the moment, but it's hard to live intentionally without a purpose, or hard to like practice deliberately without a goal. And so I think that's kind of interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
It just that it seems like you're speaking to the tension between being and becoming.
To some degree. I mean, the obviously there's a lot there. There's a lot of importance. Even Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning talked about how the people who lost a sense of future ultimately lost meaning in the present and died quickly. The people in the Holocaust, like once they lost a goal
right,
and a purpose, the present became unbearable, and so many of them died. And so I think that's interesting. But what's the point, kind of, with the idea of labeling, is that people are often so definitive in how they explain their current self with such terms as like introvert or INTJ. Like they're very, very definitive in their current perspective and current identity explanations, that I think that creates what I would call a fixed mindset. I think it leads to inflexible thinking. It also devalues the fact that their future self actually will be different without trying much. But if they were to think about who their future self could be, they could then make adjustments versus tightening that comfort zone.
I like the idea, or that what comes to mind to me as we're talking about this, is like the idea of seasons, right? That let's say that you're a tree, and you're a tree in the wintertime, and that's really different than a tree in the springtime where it has all sorts of leaves, which is still very different than
context. In other words.
that when I think about, am I the same person that I was 10 years ago? Well, I didn't marry a widower and have stepkids until, 8 years ago. So being in a very different phase of life now than I was then, I couldn't even imagine the life that I have now compared to where I was 10 years ago. And certainly all the lessons and opportunities for growth that brings out, and how I navigate the world and how I think of myself. It's like there was no way that identity label like parent was coming anywhere near me 10 years ago. It's just that was
or
not
the thought
something.
processes or everything that comes with that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, and yet when I think about, I actually created a meditation about advice from your future self that I use with my course members, because it very much is about feeling into who do we want to be, and then how do we line up with that. It's like that idea of charting our course towards something meaningful in the future. It begins with being able to take small steps in the present, and then that over time gets us to where we want to be, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think I like that exercise that you do a lot. I think it's very smart. It intrigues me trying to connect that to the idea of a core self. I definitely believe, I think that this is like an ultimate tension and conflict, right? Is like, and it's something that I tried to take on with this book, just like in Willpower Doesn't Work. I tried to take on like the nature versus nurture, right? If environment doesn't matter, then you are who you are. But if you're shaped by a living system, what does that have to say about nurture, right? In this book, it's like, do you have an unchangeable self that you were born as, which I think is a common view of personality, which is that it's innate, it's non-flexible, you are who you are, and therefore you discover yourself. This idea of a future self, which from my perspective is about decisions. It's about choices versus discovery. It's about who do you want to be, or who do you decide to be? And what does your future self tell you?
Yes.
As an example, if you made all of your decisions based on current preferences, and I think that that's kind of a common view of personality, is that it's kind of a pleasure versus pain model, where you do what is innate, you do what's easy, you do what's intuitive, and you avoid those weaknesses that are clearly outside of who you are as a person. You avoid what's painful, you pursue what's pleasurable. Whereas kind of this whole future self concept, and even kind of from a Frankl perspective, having a sense of purpose, where it's like, from Frankl's perspective, you can go through a lot of spiritual and emotional and personal development, even through suffering. But that suffering doesn't necessarily equate to growth if it doesn't have a purpose. And so, he was big on purpose and future, whereas Freud was big on the past, and big on essentially childhood sexual fantasy and whatnot. I personally prefer Frankl's, where it's more about decision, choice, about who you decide to be, And I think that's really what gives meaning to the present. Like a couple days ago, my son Logan wanted me to come swimming with him, and I really didn't want to in the present moment because I was exhausted from talking to people like you who are really smart and exhausting my brain. And I just didn't want to do it. I was just tired. But like the thought came to me that if I was watching this episode as my future self, like I would not want to just sit and not swim with my son. Like if he's sitting there asking, like I didn't want to just be sitting there watching, like looking at Facebook or looking at YouTube because I was. And so I think that the idea of intentionality and also energy can very much, I mean, you can get energy from the past, very much so. You can, you can remember and be inspired, but I think that you can also get a lot of energy in the present from intention towards a purpose. And when you're inspired or driven by a purpose, I think that can actually be a very powerful shaper of your personality. And that's actually the premise of the book, is that purpose should be the thing shaping who you are, not the past.
This episode of A Healthy Curiosity is brought to you by the DIY version of Level Up Your Life. If you've fallen into some bad habits over quarantine, it is time for an upgrade. It's time to upgrade your nutrition, your rest, your movement, your meditation practice, and your mindset that you have the right to take care of yourself. Level Up Your Life gives you the structure, habit change strategy, and support you need to bridge the gap between what you know you need to be doing to take care of yourself and actually doing it. When you register for Level Up, you'll get a 6-month membership, which is enough time to go through all 10 modules twice. Or give yourself a few weeks on a habit that's particularly challenging and speed through the ones that you already have dialed in. In addition to the downloadable curriculum, you get 3 one-on-one laser coaching sessions with me, access to a group Q&A call once a month, and access to a members-only forum to stay connected to others who are taking steps in the direction of better. Visit brodywelch.com/level up by July 15th to save big. Okay, so I have a question for you that has to do with, I guess maybe if we were to thin slice personality into like subdivide that, I'm going to go with temperament as an important perhaps concept, because one of the things I would love to be is more patient and flexible. And
that's really cool.
Like I would love to. So for example, like I live with a teenager who.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wonder if these things were interesting to you 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or if this is a new situational thing. Anyways, keep going. This is really cool.
Well, just realizing that like, okay, as much as I want to, like my husband is one of those like total easygoing people. It takes a lot to ruffle his feathers. He's very, what we would call, in Ayurveda, he would be like a kapha type. In Chinese medicine, he would be considered having a lot of earth and fire energy. So, a lot of kind of like grounded, supportive, loyal, peacekeeping, like a lot of that is in his personality. And I feel like I tried to be that for like a whole bunch of years. I tried to be like, oh, I'll just keep my sense of self as like the person who makes everyone else happy and the person who's completely self-sacrificing. And it's like, that didn't work. But anyway, at this stage of life, for example, like wanting to be more go with the flow, wanting to be more compassionate and understanding with things that my judging mind is like, really? Like really, like you left your dishes in the sink again, that because teenagers are not great roommates, it turns out. And so being able to have this value of kindness and easygoing and perspective and like, it's just the dishes and can't they let it go? It's like temperamentally, I am not cut out for like it's taking a whole lot of work for me to try to cultivate my future self as someone who just really doesn't care about the state of the kitchen, for example. So it's one of those things where like if I had a different temperament, it would be a whole lot easier for me to grow this aspect of personality goal, shall we say. Does that make sense to you? Or like
yeah. So are you saying you can still do it, but if you had a different temperament, it would be easier?
Absolutely. Yes. Like that, because I do feel like we all have our natural strengths that we can cultivate. And we all have areas of our personality that we can round out with effort.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's skills and personality and even future self, all these things, they're very, it's tough to disconnect them. Like, I mean, I even think about Michael Jordan, and again, we're not necessarily talking about personality in this sense, but I think that it lends to the conversation. Like, Michael Jordan is being talked a lot about right now because he's got all these documentaries coming out about him. But like, when he came into the NBA, his temperament, you could say, was just to ride his natural or his extreme physical ability. He was always doing slam dunks and flying at the hoop. Turned out, though, if he really wanted to score championships, he actually needed to become a good team player, and he actually had to get good at shooting. Both of those things he was really bad at. He was not, I guess you could say, a team-oriented person. He liked the flash, and also the NBA was, I mean, his coach was really concerned, and actually, in general, people were concerned because he wasn't that great of a shooter coming in. So, like, from a Michael Jordan perspective, and I'd be interested in your take on this. Obviously he was playing basketball, so he had a lot of, we could call it natural ability in basketball, or at least in athletics. But like, his bents towards individual achievement and also towards flying at the hoop were the opposite of what were required to actually achieve his goal, which in this case was win championships. And so in many ways, in order for him to actually achieve his goals, he had to go the opposite way that he would naturally go. And he had a really good coach who was actually also into like Buddhism and Eastern philosophies and things like that, but like, who helped him kind of in many ways let go of those sides of himself. I mean, he still was able to be Michael and still be obviously who he was, but it was almost like he became an amazing team player. He was still the individual crazy person he was, but he also became one of the best shooters in the NBA. And his coach said it was not a strength that he had coming into the league. Like, it was something he had to develop for over a decade of grueling work. And so I don't know. I'm wondering how it relates to myself, and also just to someone like Michael. And I'd be really interested in your interpretation, because the idea of natural strength, I'm wondering about it. I believe that we all are born differently and that we come with things. But just as an example, like even writing this book and writing in general, like, yes, my blog posts have been read many, many millions of times, but to me, that doesn't even really matter. Like writing this book was way harder for me than doing things that I would consider a weakness. Like, I wouldn't even consider writing, actually. Some people may consider it a strength of mine, but if it was a strength, then why is it so hard? Like, writing this book was not any, and I don't think you have to say that a strength makes it easy. Maybe it just makes it something that you have a higher like ceiling on. I don't really know, but writing this book was hell in many ways. And like, that's not to say I didn't find joy in it, but like, it was far from like an easy, pleasurable experience, far from an experience that I would consider something I had a strength in. And maybe even parenting, like, I have 5 kids, and I feel like that is an ultimate weakness, or at least it's a situation that allows for weaknesses to be highlighted that in lesser straining situations could be easily ignored. So I don't know. I'm intrigued, because the elements of my life that have the most meaning and also that provide the most growth are the absolute hardest aspects of my life. And I wouldn't consider them strengths per se, but areas where I've decided I wanted to develop. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that there are, well, you said a lot there. In the Jordan example, it seems like the guy comes into the world with an incredible natural physical ability.
Totally.
And
Undeniable.
That's not where his greatness comes from, right? His greatness comes from a combination of that natural innate talent with the things that he chose to cultivate that he needed in order to succeed, like his teamwork and shooting ability, right? That's what you're saying, is that it was a combination. He took his natural gift and then he chose to round out his skill set based on what his coach saw that he needed to do in order to be truly great. And to me, it's like, if there's a notion, again, going back to the Chinese medicine notion of destiny, that the idea of fulfilling our destiny it's not incompatible with this idea of free will, but that the idea that if you have something that's innately special and particular about you, a particular talent, a particular gift, a particular way in which something that just shows up when you do, something that you can't really separate from, that shines through, that has a purpose, that uniqueness has a purpose to be put to work. And teasing that purpose out from the conditioning of how we're supposed to get through life, or like what other people value, what other people want us to do, the pressures that are placed upon us, how we've reacted to trauma, all those layers of conditioning, that some of that is there so that we can learn lessons and graduate, right? This idea that if the soul is just borrowing this particular set of DNA and this body and this and this particular, if you believe in astrology, the idea that physiology, like that there's timing, and like that the timing in which you came into the world, as well as the physicality that you came in with, that those are the yin and the yang of kind of the predetermined you, and that everything else is kind of is a social layer on top of it. And that if there are lessons that were to be learned in this life, that graduating from them frees us up to kind of like, once we've met those, then we get to play in the realm of like taking electives instead of fulfilling our curriculum. This is in the words of one of my teachers, Dr. Jeffrey Wen. And I just really like that, the idea that like there's certain things that are on our plate to fulfill in this life, and that a lot of times, like, actually, I'm even reminded of that part of your book, Willpower Doesn't Work, where you talk about the guy who gets stuck in the mud in his truck, and he's like can't get out. His truck is stuck in the mud. He tries getting out and shoveling around the tires.
Snow.
Oh, is it snow? Okay, got it. So he's stuck, and he ends up chopping a bunch of wood and filling his truck with wood. And then it's precisely the heavy load of the wood that's needed in order for him to get the traction that he needs to get the truck back on the road. And so like that idea that this adversity, the difficult stuff that we go through that teaches us things, that can be a motivating factor in us doing something hard, or it can be like the impetus to grow in a different direction, or to try something that we otherwise wouldn't. So that the notion that kind of like the grist for the mill, the things that are happening in our lives that are maybe even the most challenging, can help us develop something that can be considered a great strength.
Definitely. Yeah, I love that. I was even reminded of that principle further, going back through Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl talked a lot about, so from his perspective, and I tend to agree, especially with the story you just told with the guy in the truck, like his view of happiness is not the absence of pain, but it's kind of going through challenge or just whatever it may be, but with a purpose that gives it meaning. And it's not just suffering for suffering's sake, but it's actually going through a developmental process, kind of like what you described as curriculum, maybe, or just serving someone. But Frankl talked about kind of like an arch, like an arch made out of rocks, and about how the way to strengthen it is actually to put more weight on top of it, not to remove. Like you push down on the top of the structure, and that actually strengthens the structure, which is kind of interesting. It reminds me of the poem, Good timber does not grow with ease. Right. Which is something I guess I could share in the book. So I don't know. It's all very intriguing, but I think that this is a radically different direction. I think that, I guess the idea, one of the things I pose in the book that I think is maybe a common view of personality, it doesn't seem like it's how you view personality, but I think a common way is that this is who I am. Like these are the strengths or the weaknesses that I have, and I need not go outside of that, or there's an avoidance. That's definitely not what you're saying. I think you're saying that we all have strengths that we come with, and that also there are areas of ourselves that can be rounded out through experience, through challenge, through relationships, through other things, and that it's really the combination of the two that is essential.
Yeah, and how we show up in the world. Like, I would be very curious to know that. So, for example, that we're all going through this confusing time of the stay-at-home, shelter-in-place COVID era right now. If you're listening in real time, this is what's happening for most of us, and it's like, so this is obviously a stressful, confusing period in life. How can we, so for a lot of us, if we have our go-to personalities that come out when we're under stress, and we don't necessarily like that. Maybe we don't like that becoming overly controlling, or becoming angry or frustrated, or just unproductive, and when in doubt, do nothing, or kind of whatever our survival techniques are right now. How can we allow this heavy load, or this timber under pressure? How can we make sure that this is actually helping us grow and not break?
I think that it would be quite difficult to do so. Like, so there's Malcolm Gladwell came up with the idea 10,000 hours, right? 10,000 hour rule.
To be an expert in something.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And let's just say you go through many COVID-19s. Just going through this experience doesn't necessarily translate to learning, right? I mean, it could actually translate to you becoming worse. And yep. I think sometimes 10,000 hours doesn't mean you actually got better. It actually means you got worse.
Yeah, right. Like, you thought you were growing, but you were really reinforcing the same mistakes over and over again, or
something like that. And so I think that it's not really a 10,000 hour rule. I think it's really about deliberate practice. And so I think that
yes, that's the other piece that people forget about about Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really the idea. I mean, it may not take 10,000 hours if the practice and if the learning is quick enough. I mean, if someone's really good at taking their experience and transferring it to learning. And obviously the best way to do that would be to be deliberate towards a goal. It's actually impossible to engage in deliberate practice without a specific future self that you're seeking. And so I kind of think with this situation, I think it really, you do need to be purposeful about it. What do you want to get out of this? Like, you have to turn this experience, like, there's raw material here. Like, it's COVID-19, it's raw material. None of us are going to look at it the same way. And so you can take it and you can choose to turn it into something. You can turn it into, I want to become more patient, or I want to now be an entrepreneur. I want to be more creative. I want to connect with my kids. Like, what do you want to turn this raw experience into? And I think that that's kind of where future self really comes to play, is like, the only reason to use this to develop something specific is that there has to be some reason to do it. Otherwise, it might just be experience that doesn't necessarily transfer to either, as you would describe it, evolution or learning. I mean, it could lead to something. I mean, it may be an unintentional kind of just random evolution, I guess you could say, that's just brought on by a circumstance, which I guess maybe has some value. But I think you can get a lot more out of your education. You can mine it. It's just a lot thicker and deeper if you actually have a purpose that you're using to transform it into. So I think that that's kind of, from my perspective, the key is you'd have to have a reason and a goal, essentially, for what you do with this, so that you can give this meaning. Kind of like Frankl gave a lot of his experience in the Holocaust meaning, which transferred to a deep education about people, because ultimately that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to get out of the concentration camp and teach people and do lectures and write books and stuff. And so his education in the concentration camp led to that end, because he decided to use it for that end.
So it's almost like if you were writing a book, you'd be thinking about, how do I want this book to end? Like, what's the last chapter look like, so that I can work backwards and think about, what does my character have to do right now?
I think that's pretty crucial. I think that, from a decision-making standpoint, and this is honestly, I'm not really sure how people feel about this, but I actually think that your future self is more important than who you are today. I think that who you are today is very temporary, very temporal, and that it's something to be less held on to. The overly holding to the persona or the identity of the current self and over can really stunt flexibility in learning. So yeah, I think that for Frankl, I mean, it's not like it has to be end game. It could just be like, where do I want to be when this pandemic is over? Or where do I want to be in 2 years from now? But that really helped him to take his experience and to turn it into learning and to be, I mean, he became very flexible. I think he was also very comfortable with the idea of dying, but he said he had a purpose, and that the moment that a person lacked that, and the moment a person lacked a goal, there really was self almost lacked the ability to actually use the experience for something tangible. Instead, the experience overwhelmed the person. And I really, to some degree, agree with that. I actually like what these type of experiences do for people. I think, it was like me when you're a parent as well. Like when we became foster parents of 3 kids, all of a sudden we were forced to grapple with stuff that we didn't know existed before. And I think that that's what these types of situations do. I mean, they can, and I think if you do have like a future oriented approach, and that doesn't mean you ignore the past or the present, because the past is a deep well as well, but it allows you to take what you're doing and use it beautifully.
In Chinese medicine, the notion of purpose and destiny and innate gifts all relate to the kidney system.
Interesting.
There's an idea that the kidneys house this substance called the jing, which is this like elixir of it's this concept of the stuff that we came in with. That's also a reservoir that we can pull from, but that it's like the pilot light for our whole life experience. And that if the heart contains the consciousness, that the consciousness reflecting on the essence and recognizing kind of like the true purpose for your life, and then making that manifest is kind of how it works. And obviously that's going to be different from moment to moment. And so being able to be in touch with kind of this idea of the right action in the moment, in the right now, not where it was 10 years ago, being up to date with yourself is really critical in order to live in a quote unquote authentic way, as we would describe it from a Chinese medicine perspective.
Interesting. Yeah, I like it. I mean, to me, that's actually how you reorient or reinterpret the past. I think one of the aspects of trauma is that it's still being interpreted from the lens of when the event occurred. And part of, I think, development and maturity is viewing the former experiences from the lens of the present, not from the lens of the past, and then to reassign meanings that may be from a higher vantage point. You couldn't maybe understand or explain how something happened when you were 5, 10, 15 years old, but you can kind of assign different meanings and context and perspective as you've kind of grown to mature. And you can say, maybe how I thought I saw that experience, or maybe how I felt about it, doesn't have to be how I still feel about it.
And a lot of times the story that we made up when we were 8 or 10 to explain reality, it can't possibly be the full picture. And then looking back with our adult mind and going back and changing that meaning from a place of compassion and from a place of a more complete way of seeing the situation from a third party perspective, and from your full adult perspective, I think that is how we get over the past and how we get over trauma, so that we don't have to be bound by it.
I mean, that's actually Frankl's perspective of how you get over the present, is by doing the same thing with your future self.
Okay. All right.
So, I mean, what we're describing is getting over the past through a more complete present, but I think you get over the present through a more complete future. And I think that, your idea is really interesting to me, because it's like that same, idea can be said about our current self, that in the future, we're going to realize that we were quite childish or immature today, even though today we thought we had it all figured out.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your relationship with your future self. Like, do you journal from your future self's perspective? Do you use your present day value system to cast an image of what the future could be? Like what, or do you let the future emerge based on a general sense of a trajectory of what you want to be doing? I'd love to know how you dance with this concept personally.
Um, Well, the future version of me, I'm more practical about it. I mean, I definitely have values and I have belief systems. I mean, I have actually quite religious belief systems, but like the goals that I could assign or the future self that I could talk to today is different than the future self I would probably talk to 3 or 4 years ago. Because obviously I've grown a lot, right? And I think that what you're exposed to, what you believe in, like those are the things that project out. But I also think like, so for me, a lot of it has to do with just who I want to be, like who's the person I want to be, but also who's the person I believe I should be. Right. So like, there's a kind of a combination there. Like who's the person I believe I should be, or I want to be. They say that the number one deathbed regret is obviously that you didn't be the person you believed you wanted to be. Instead, you lived up to the expectations. And so it's kind of a mix of what you've already been talking about. But for me, it's very practical. I mean, I do a ton of journaling. I like kind of thinking about it more in terms of more close future, probably like 2-3 years. I do it around like I kind of view my life in chapters. So like right now I'm in a chapter. You know, my last chapter was finishing PhD, becoming professional writer. And like I don't need to use those exact terms, but like I'm just kind of being like really blunt
Yeah,
with
you're
it. Like
you're demarking eras of your life,
yeah,
and that's
yeah,
what the
but
defining feature of that landscape was, and now it's different.
yeah, I mean, getting the three to, we live in a different state now and stuff like that. But like that experience and what it was and how I'm looking at it was all future facing while it was occurring. It was facing the reality that I'm now living in, like getting the PhD, becoming the professional writer, going through the foster system, like everything about that experience and how I look back and define it was all looking in the direction that I'm now standing. And so like, although I was living in the present then, we were very much enjoying our time in South Carolina. We enjoyed going to the zoo, like I enjoyed going to school and sitting through lectures. I enjoyed writing hundreds of blog posts, like it was all still pointing a direction. And so I think that the future self is the direction that you're striving to point yourself in. And once you get to a certain place, you can point yourself in a direction that your prior self maybe couldn't see, like maybe up the mountain, I guess you could say. And so like now, I mean, the direction I'm pointing has a lot to do with where I want my next chapter to be. And kind of the next chapter from my perspective being the higher use of my time based on what I currently know, based on where I'm at right now. Like I'm grateful for where I'm at right now. But I think that from where I'm sitting, there's much more to do. And so like, I'm now thinking, what is that? I mean, I think it's really actually important to question your current goals, question your current trajectory. Like in the book, I talk about a guy named Andre Norman who went to prison for 14 years. And then he ended up becoming a fellow at Harvard. And like, his goal became to go to Harvard. And he had to eventually question his trajectory. He talks about it as his Yellow Brick Road moment, or like his Wizard of Oz moment. Like when he was in prison and he was trying to be the number one thug, he realized that like the goal or the purpose he had been pursuing, and that's really a key, is that whatever it is you're pursuing is the thing shaping your identity. And your identity is the thing shaping your behavior and ultimately your personality. So like you yourself, like you're facing a direction, whether it's intentional or not, like you have a purpose. And I know that you're obviously someone who's quite thoughtful about it. And so, but like, even still, everything you're doing is driving towards something, and that's the thing shaping your identity. And for Andre, he finally came to the conclusion that he had to question that and say, am I on a yellow brick road going to nowhere? Like, and he came to the conclusion that becoming the number one guy in prison wasn't a worthy goal. And so he had to then question his goal and ultimately assign himself a new purpose, which allowed him a fresh identity towards which to work towards. And so I think asking yourself those types of questions, like, is the thing I'm currently going for something that's worth going for? So, I mean, I do a lot of journaling, a lot of prompts. Throughout the book, actually, there's about 150 prompts. But yeah, to me, it's a journaling experience, and it's more short term. Like right now, the future self that I'm thinking a lot about is like 2 or 3 years into the future.
Your future self is like your older brother. You're like somebody who's just a little further along the path, and you're like, who knows what it's like.
I'm a believer in like quantum leaps. So my future self is like 80 years into the future, and I'm trying to get there in 2.
Okay. All right. Great.
It's more of a wormhole jump through.
Okay. I like that. You mentioned earlier, like kind of the danger of creating a fixed self, this notion that this is who I am and this is all I'll ever be. And what is now is who I'm destined to be forever.
I don't think people think about it like that, but that's how people talk about it.
Yeah, sure. Like, oh yeah, like, oh, I'm no good at this. Like people, that's something I hear all the time. Like, oh yeah, they're arguing for a limitation.
Arguing for that. Yeah.
That they haven't necessarily even bothered to challenge. I'm curious what advice you might have for someone who is really stuck on a negative label or is stuck in a fixed mindset that basically everything in their life experience has told them that this is true.
So what would you say? What would I say to that person?
Yeah. Like, how would you help that person overcome that belief that whether that's something small, like, technology hates me, or like I can't cook, or like, oh, I'm forgetful, like if everything in this person's life has taught them this, how do you help them overcome that notion that that's who they have to be forever?
Yes. So one of the things that happens when we define ourselves, and we all do it, is that we then see our past, present, and future from the perspective of our definition. So like Ellen Langer at Harvard would call this mindlessness. So like one of the reasons to be a little weary of your label is because there's actually many instances when it's not true, but which you pay no heed to. So,
oh yeah, like a confirmation bias situation.
That's it. So like when you have a label, for example, Ellen Langer, one of the things that leads people to ultimately being mindless is how you describe yourself, your label. So like if someone describes themselves as depressed, they will see that they'll see themselves as pretty much always being depressed, that it's always true. When like from an outside perspective, there's actually many instances when that person actually isn't displaying that. They're actually like looking and feeling quite happy. But they won't notice that. Like we call it selective attention in psychology. Like basically labels or, your current worldview is tunnel vision, right? So you may think that that's how you've always been. But my guess is that there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. There's probably plenty of evidence suggesting that actually you're not that bad at technology. Yes, you've had probably some instances which, yes, maybe seemingly they've created enough emotion that that's now a lens, right? And I'm not declining that there are those failures, but I think if you took some time to think about when was the opposite true, I think that could be found.
So looking for evidence that of the exact opposite at least pokes holes in the theory that this is absolutely true and therefore allows there to be some room for growth.
I think it just allows you to dissipate the idea that this is how you have to see yourself.
Yeah.
Because it definitely is a story. I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, you have a choice. Either the past can predict the future, or the future can predict in many ways, predict the past, but also predict the present. And so I would ask this person, okay, so you're not good at technology. Do you have any reason or desire to get good at it? If the answer was no, I would ask, well, what future would you want? And is your future being limited by this fact? Like, have you consigned yourself to something less than you would actually choose just because this is part of the equation, right? Like, because often these labels ultimately determine our goals, right? Like if you're someone who's chosen to believe the idea that you're bad at technology, then what that means is that your future is devoid of you being good at technology or even doing things that would require you to be good at it. And so I think to me, it's actually less important where they've been in the past and even where they're at right now. And it's more interesting or more important to say, okay, all of that aside, what is it you actually want if you could have it? Because I mean, I there was no evidence, as one example, that I had any capability of writing. But through enough experiences, I decided that that would be something very worthwhile to pursue. And so I had no evidence to suggest I could be a writer.
And you created evidence that you could.
Yeah, well, I decided it was worth creating evidence. I decided it was worth. I felt like it would be something that would be valuable to do. I think that there needs to be a development of confidence, in other words. So like, I think I like small wins, but like this person who doesn't think that they are good at technology, if you could show them small instances where they could be, that belief system would start to become a little bit more flexible.
I really appreciate that you brought up the small wins concept, because it's something that I use with my coaching clients to help them see that they are in fact changing, and that it's like they can no longer say that, right? That it's that the more that we recognize the more that we can find evidence for something other than our usual limiting story, the more becomes possible.
Yeah, there's a good concept from Dan Sullivan. He calls it the gain and the gap. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually use that in chapter 4 of this book as a framework for reframing kind of any trauma. But I think that you can look at the gains. Like, it's easy to not see the gains. I see that all the time with myself and with my kids. Like when I'm talking to my kids, I can still see them as the person I thought they were 3 or 4 years ago. And then my wife can point out, actually, look, they've been doing things a lot differently. And then I can say, oh, there actually has been huge gains, and I probably should get out of the gap.
Updating your files as much as possible so that we can allow the people around us to evolve is I think, an incredible act of love.
Yeah, I agree. That takes mindfulness, though.
It definitely does. It takes conscious awareness that and recognizing that your old perspective doesn't have the final say, and that actually, just to bring it full circle in Chinese medicine, when we no longer have the ability to change is when we're old, is when we age. So as long as we stay supple, and that if water is this sort of metaphor for life, if we can stay flowing and adapting and changing like water, we keep our possibilities unlimited.
Yeah. I think Einstein said it. Maybe he didn't. It could be apocryphal, but there's a quote: "The measure of intelligence is the ability to change."
I love that.
So I like the quote as well.
Well, Ben, I feel like I could talk to you all day, but I know that we are both busy people with other things that we have to get to. Do you want to just let people know where people can connect with you or get the book Personality Isn't Permanent if they're so interested?
Sure. You can get the book anywhere you would like, wherever you buy books, all available, all sources. My website's benjaminhardy.com. I have multiple online courses that are being given away for free associated with this book, taking you through the journal prompts, taking you through the concepts. I also give away other courses, such as like my blogging courses that have led to many, I guess you could say much success in the blogging realm. That's all just free resources available through benjaminhardy.com.
Great. And we'll make sure that gets a link in our show notes over at brodywelch.com. Ben Hardy, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you so much, Brody.
Thanks for listening today. To check out the show notes, get on my email list, or drop me a line, head to brodywelch.com. That's Brody with an IE and Welch with a CH. I'd love to hear from you. If you learned something new or feel inspired to try something different in your life, I'd love for you to pay it forward by sharing this episode with a friend who you think could also benefit, and give them a reason to listen. You'll be helping to create a world where we encourage each other to embody self-respect. Till next time, be good to yourself.